Good evening and welcome to the fourth open discussion as part of the ongoing conference, Chaos at the Museum, Infiltrating the Urban Fabric. The four-day conference has drawn artists, designers, and museum professionals from around the world to tackle the question of what it means for the museum to step outside of its own building and creatively redefine them as sites of social encounter and infiltrate civic spaces in dialogue with the communities they serve. The conference has been organized by the TIPA Foundation in collaboration with the University of California, Davis in the USA, the George Washington University, also in the USA, and Central St. Martin's in the UK, and serves as a milestone in the progress of museums towards renewed relevance and inclusivity. My name is Jim Volkert, and it's my pleasure to moderate this discussion with three luminaries in the museum world, each with a global reputation as both a theorist and practitioner, and each dedicated to advancing museums as a cultural necessity. Let me introduce to you David Anderson, Elaine Gurian, and Americo Castilla. You could clap. Good. I will give a more formal introduction of each of them and invite each to respond to a question, followed by a broader discussion, and finally some time for audience questions. David Anderson was appointed to the National Museum of Wales as director in 2010. Prior to that, he was the director of learning at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. In 1999, he was awarded the Order of the British Empire for services to museums and education. He has been an advisor to the UK government on a wide range of initiatives, including Culture Online, creative partnerships, and a national museum and gallery education strategy. He is internationally recognized as an authority on cultural strategy and arts education. David, welcome. So, at the Reimagining Museums Conference last year here in Buenos Aires, you said that, quote, the Anglo-European museum model has had its day. You also said that museums are anchor institutions that are vital to the communities they serve. Now in the second decade of the 21st century, can you expand a bit on what you meant by the passing of the old model and explore the values you deem necessary for a new model of civic engagement? Would you like to do that?
Thank you. That's an easy question to answer, that one. When I was leaving school and my mother was getting worried about what I might do for my future, she was somebody from rural Ireland, and she thought there were only 5 professions which were respectable: a minister in the church, a teacher, like her, a bank manager, a lawyer, or a doctor. Most of those elements that were public spaces, arguably, the school, the local church, have shrunk or disappeared in many communities. And the museums and libraries seem to be, in the United Kingdom anyway, potentially going the same way, are going the same way. So where will communities have their public spaces if all these public institutions locally are fading away? I have to admit there is no single old model, but I think there are some dominant characteristics, really, which the Anglo-European Museum has had for more than a century. Hierarchies of expertise, a focus on means, collections and buildings over ends, society, activity which is safely held within the walls for the most part, a comfort with a conservative society which patently is not working for so many of its citizens, rather than being part of social change or activism, a complete lack of a social vision, and what Mark O'Neill calls a welfare model in trying to reach to those who don't participate. In other words, the problem lies out there with the individual or the community from which they come, not with the basic model of the museum itself. And for me, the archetype of the old Anglo-European model is the British Museum, which is, in many respects, quite a mediocre museum floating on a sea of wonderful objects, but still held up as an ideal in many parts of the world. In looking at the critics of museums, we can see that they were there right from the very beginning. Somebody you probably have never come across, Dr. John Brown, his book in 1858, Education Through the Senses. One of his articles was a savage attack on the South Kensington Museum. And he said it, for children, instead of feeding them bread, it fed them stones. And he urged learning through the senses, not through taxonomies, learning through experience. John Ruskin, the art critic, wrote a letter to the director of the South Kensington Museum a decade or so later, asking if there was room for Queen Mab's chariot. That's the Queen of the Fairies in English folklore, Queen Mab's chariot, among all those steam engines. But then William Morris, I have to say one of my great heroes for his thought, even more than for his wallpaper. His biographer, Fiona McCarthy, said what drove him to revolutionary activism was his anger and shame at the injustices within society. And I've put on a pair of museum spectacles to read again his novel, utopian novel, News from Nowhere. And in that, it's art is in the detail of the household goods, in the conservation of the countryside, in thoughtful planning of towns, and the proper upkeep of roads. In other words, art is in the texture of daily life. And another hero of mine, Patrick Geddes, had perhaps one of the most wonderful briefs ever given to anybody to do with museums. He was offered a huge amount of money by Andrew Carnegie to transform the entire city that Carnegie had been born in Scotland, Dunfermline, and was invited to come up with a plan. And his plan was, in fact, to make the city a museum and to transform it through the work of its own citizens, its children, its young people, apprentices and others. And he said, I have no faith in the educational value of the commonplace art museum, with its metal masterpieces in a glass case, and the smithy nowhere. In other words, the looking but not the making. And his vision for the transformation of Dunfermline was never taken up because the leading citizens of the city thought it was too radical, too revolutionary to have it rebuilt by its own citizens and to have its museological thinking embedded within the stones of all the buildings and all the roads and all the streets. He was so dedicated to the idea that it was the texture of the place that was so important that he photographed even sewage pipes running down into rivers and showed how that part of the town could be changed to make it better. So for me, all the critics of the 19th century and early 20th century have already given many of the things that were wrong with this model that we're still persisting in. And it's hard not to believe the reason we're still persisting with it is essentially ideological rather than one based on any rational analysis of how things work. Essentially, we're still continuing with what is a utopian model, where objects are timeless, human behavior within our museum walls is tightly controlled, very separate from the world outside, and whose rules are unquestioned. Classic utopian stuff that actually so easily becomes dystopian. And also Sherwood Anderson, no relation's book, Weinberg. The first story in that book, published in 1919, is The Book of the Grotesque. And in that, he describes one of his characters having a dream. In the beginning, when the world was young, there were a great many thoughts, but no such thing as a truth. Man made truths himself. All about the world were truths, and they were all beautiful. And then the people came along. Each as he appeared snatched up one of the truths, and some who were quite strong snatched up a dozen of them. It was the truths that made people grotesque. The moment one of the people called the truth his truth and tried to live his life by it, he became grotesque, and the truth he embraced became a falsehood. What haunts me is that we've taken the truth that lay around the idea of the museum all those decades, centuries ago. We've embraced it and made it into a falsehood and made ourselves grotesque in the process of that. So perhaps then we have to rethink this concept Maybe, in fact, museum isn't particularly the building or the collections or the exhibition or the archives or the staff, but it's a way of thinking and a way of acting, and a place for debate of all the issues connected to the society we actually live in, wherever that takes place. So maybe that Morris was right. Morris, the communist, one has to say, was right. Our task is the education of desire, the stimulation of a wish to improve the quality of our lives. It's culture and action, the uses of culture for learning and creativity and pleasure that defines the quality of a society and perhaps the quality of a museum. As we go deeper into the dark wood that is the 21st century, we should stop looking only for abstract truth, but maybe look more for relevant meaning and social justice. And then what would the museum that embodied that look like?
Thank you. Thank you, David.
We're going to start using this.
Okay. Everyone can still hear? That's all good? All right. Elaine Human-Gurian is a consultant and advisor to museums that are beginning, building, or reinventing themselves. She specializes in coaching government museums, large and small, national and international museums that are going through significant change. In 2004, she received the Distinguished Service to Museums Award, America's most important museum honor, presented by the American Alliance of Museums. In 2006, Elaine was designated as one of the 100 Centennial Honor Roll members by the same alliance. Over the past 45 years, Elaine has served as acting director of the Cranbrook Institute for Sciences, deputy director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, deputy director for public program planning at the National Museum of the American Indian, deputy assistant director for museums for the entire Smithsonian Institution, director of the Exhibit Center at the Boston Children's Museum, and director of education at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston. Elaine's collected writing, Civilizing the Museum, was published by Routledge in 2006, and in 2008 she was granted a Fulbright scholarship to Buenos Aires, and she continues to lecture and teach nationally and internationally. So, Elaine, wow. Scientists believe that the most interesting parts of their discipline happen on the edges of the discipline, and where two disciplines bump up against each other, whether it's ecosystems, whether it's biological systems, that it's the edges that are most important. And in the context of this conference, Chaos in the Museum, how is it that you see that edge, and perhaps even where is that edge between public and private in institutional thinking?
So a word about that biography. If you're 80, you could have that. All of you will have that. That's just putting one step in front of the other, and don't get too impressed by any of it. A word about my friend David Anderson, who I feel blessed to be sitting at this table because I have been friends with each of these spectacular men for decades. And my David Anderson image is that I come to London once a year, we meet at a pub, it's very noisy, and I take out my pen immediately, but I didn't want to do that in front of all of you, because he quotes endlessly from books I haven't read, and I write them down so that I'll be ready for the following year. But alas, he quotes from new books the following year, so I have to write them down. That's one of the ways our friendship has gone on. But the other way is he is one of the bravest social activists I know. And unlike me, where you can see me coming, that learnedness, that book thing makes you think, oh, right, he's a good old Brit, it'll all be okay. So you don't see him coming with the same accuracy you see me.
Stop.
Okay, so let me talk about edges and what I'm talking about. I could go on about Mako, but then he hasn't talked yet. The first question you're asking is how come we elected Donald Trump? Because I'm the first American who's supposed to be talking. And the answer to that is I don't know. But I realize all my writing has happened. Let me go back a second. I'm the daughter of German Jewish immigrants. They did not flee to the United States. They were already in the United States when the Holocaust happened. And they rushed to Europe and to Germany to save their parents and their siblings and their cousins, and they did very well. They each saved about 50 people. Some of them I know, some of them I don't, but that didn't mean they could save the whole family. And that meant I was raised in a household of fear and decided when I was an adult that I could stop being afraid, and now we have a president in which fear has re-entered into the American psyche and into every minority. I've had a very interesting conversation with, I'd like to say, my friend Debbie Mack, and talk about what it was that we were trained to do with that fear and in the face of that kind of politics, and what our cultural history trained us to do. So all of us in the United States, and I think around the world, are re-engaging with a place in which the notion of bringing everybody together is more fraught than it has been for me in decades, in which the stranger is not necessarily my potential friend. But I realize that my writing for the last 30 years has been based on the notion that the stranger is my potential friend. And so I don't know, I'm sitting in front of you on edge and not completely organized. Let me tell you, before Donald Trump got elected, what I was thinking about, and I'll come back next year having read David Anderson's books and having new thoughts. The first one is about peaceful assembly. Peaceful assembly in the United States is a right written in our Constitution, and it is 20A in the rights of the United Nations. Peaceful assembly, which means strangers can organize together, is a right by the United Nations thought. A right, not something nice to have, or we have it in democracy, but a right. Peaceful assembly, however, only begins by its rules in outside spaces without roofs. So one of the questions is, what does peaceful assembly have to do with public space? And what do museums have to do with private space? Because one of the things you have to ask yourself is, at what point are you welcome in the museum? That's the edge. Where is the door? Where's the metaphoric door? Where is the actual door? What test do you have to pass in order to get through the door? What's the signaling outside that tells you they meant you to come? I went to my first museum by myself at 14 years of age. I went to the Museum of Modern Art. I was a child artist. I studied art history compulsively in grainy black and white books called Die Blaue Bücher. They were in my aunt's house. They were horrible pictures of art, but that was what I was interested in. At 14, I went to the Museum of Modern Art by myself, and I was followed by the security guards. Now, this morning I thought, I was 14 and a girl. Why were they following me? And so it has occurred to me that they weren't. But I was so terrified that I didn't know how to do it that I thought they were. And I certainly understood I was not welcome here. My mother never went to a public place. My mother did not have a library card, and my mother did not go to open school night to meet my teachers. My mother entered no public space except the supermarket and the shopping mall, which she knew how to do excellently. So where is the public space? Where can strangers safely meet? And let's back up a second about strangers and say, if strangers pass each other safely, that is the beginning of urban peace. The recognition of people who are not interacting with us, but who we fear, and that we pass by safely, is one of the issues, one of the bases by which the city operates. And one of the things that happens when the city is in siege is the public spaces become either ghettoized, that is owned by certain groups and not allowable for other people, or it becomes empty. And that's what happens when attacks happen. People withdraw. Interestingly, the police system wants the city animated because it's much safer, and they have a set of rules to cause animation as often as possible, 24/7, called situational crime prevention, or SCP. These are design rules about more light, more plants, more trees, what undergrowth, cleanliness. They want parks animated. Their work is helped by an animated city. That interested me a lot. So there's a book going to be published also by Routledge, by the University of Leicester, about the foyer, or as we say in America, the lobby, about where in the lobby is it public space and where is it private space, and what is the outside, and how does it belong to everybody, and how do you signal it? So let's say the metaphoric edge is the door. The door is by itself metaphoric. And where did you mean to have everybody come and use your facility, and where did you mean only some people?
Thank you, Lynn. Americo, mi amigo. Americo Castilla is the founder of Fundación Tipa. Previously, he was the director of cultural programs at Fundación Antorchas, a national director of heritage and museums of Argentina, and director of the National Museum of Fine Art, and is currently the Minister of Culture for the nation of Argentina for cultural patrimony. As a visual artist, he's represented Argentina in the biennials of Sao Paulo and Paris. He teaches the doctoral seminar of culture and management at La Plata, the National University of La Plata, and has been the driving force behind numerous international efforts to expand the impact of museums. America. At a conference in Salzburg, you talked about the public responsibility of museums to be, quote, public spaces that are habitats for free exchange of ideas. This sort of now begins to touch on Elaine's point. More recently, in an interview, you talked about developing a new paradigm for museums centered on visitors and the public. In the context of this conference, what is necessary for this new paradigm to grow and develop? What are the requirements?
Bueno, ahora me toca hablar en español.
And now it will be Spanish.
Ante todo, el tremendo
First
orgullo
of
de
all,
estar en esta
I'm
mesa
so proud to
con
be
estas tres
here at the
grandes
table with
autoridades en el
these
tema. que
top
hace que mi
authorities in
opinión
these
no la
topics,
encuentre tan relevante como la de
I
ellos.
find my opinion not so relevant as theirs.
Jem, ya creo que es la vez
I
número
believe
40 que
it's
viene a
the
Argentina,
40th time you're here in
invitado
Argentina,
por nosotros
invited by
siempre
us
a tratar de
always
mejorar las
to try
condiciones
to
en que se
improve
exhiben
the
las colecciones en
conditions in
nuestro
which
país.
collections are
Y siempre
exhibited
lo
in
ha
our
hecho con una
country.
enorme
He's always
generosidad,
been so generous
que
in
es la
doing
base
so,
de la amistad que
which is the basis of
tenemos.
the friendship we have.
Desde sus épocas de la Smithsonian, en el
From
Museo
his
de la
times at the
American Indian,
Smithsonian, the
en adelante,
Museum of American Indians, and so on.
Elaine,
Elaine,
yo diría casi al
I
mismo
would
tiempo, es
say,
como
almost
la
as from the
amiga,
same time, she's
compañera,
the friend,
tía
the partner,
de
the
todos
aunt
nosotros,
of
porque
all of
tiene
us,
esa calidad
because she has this
de la
warmth
tía. La que
as
nos
an aunt,
permite,
auntie
y
has.
tiene
You know,
indulgencia con
she's
nuestros
very
errores,
indulgent with our errors,
y es capaz de darnos
and
los
she's
mejores
capable
consejos
of giving us
y
the
hacernos
best of
animar
advice
a
and
producir cambios
make us there
importantes.
go
Y ha estado
about
enseñando en
and bring about
Argentina también
important changes. She
muchísimas
has been
veces,
teaching in Argentina
impulsando
many
a la
times,
Fundación TIPA a que sea
fostering
cada vez más
TIPA
ambiciosa.
Foundation and pushing us to be more and more
A
ambitious.
David lo conozco
And
hace menos
David,
tiempo,
I
pero
met him more
me ha impresionado
recently, but
enormemente
I was greatly impressed
desde
by
aquella
him
vez en que
since
él
that
dirigía
time
la
where he
reunión
was in
de
charge
los
of
museos
the
británicos
direction
en
of
Cardiff,
British
en
Museums
Gales.
in Cardiff, in
Me
Wales.
impresionó
I was
por la
very much
agudeza y
impressed by
profundidad
the depth of
de su
his
análisis. De su
analysis.
análisis no solo de los museos,
His
sino de la
analysis not
condición
only about
humana.
museums, but about the
Y esto
human
es
condition.
realmente un privilegio.
This is, once
Acá
again,
no
such
estamos
a privilege
hablando
to be
de
here with you.
técnicas,
Here we're
de
not talking
cómo,
about techniques on
desarrollar mejor
how
nuestras
to
capacidades
better
en los
develop
museos,
our
sino
capacities
estamos
at
hablando de
the
algo bastante
museums.
más
We're talking
profundo,
about something that
que es
goes
¿para qué
much more
hacemos
in
esto?
depth. What are we
¿Para
doing
quién lo
this
hacemos?
for? We do
¿Cuál
this for
es el
whom?
objetivo
And what is
de
the
hacerlo? ¿Y
objective
cuál es
of
el
doing
resultado
this? What
que
is the
esperamos obtener
result that
del
we
esfuerzo
expect
de
to
congregarnos como
obtain
nos
with the
congregamos
effort
hoy,
of getting together as we're doing
para llevar
today
a cabo nuestras tareas?
to carry out our
Venimos
tasks?
de 2 días de un
We
trabajo
have
intenso que no
shared
terminó, va a
intense
continuar
work for 2
mañana y
days.
pasado,
It's not the end of it. We'll continue
de
tomorrow and the
tratar
next
en
day
conjunto
to try to,
con especialistas de muchas partes del mundo,
together with specialists
de
from many
cómo
parts of the world,
llevamos
jointly
a la calle,
see
al
how we
espacio
bring to the
público,
streets, to the
algunas de
public
las
space,
iniciativas
some of the
que nos
initiatives
proponemos en los museos.
that we at museums are
Y creo
proposing.
que al cabo de estos 2 días ya no cabe duda de
After
que
these
hemos
2
puesto como
days, there's
prioridad
no doubt that
al
the
visitante.
priority is the
Hemos
visitor.
tenido mucho menos
We have had
discusión
a lot
acerca
less
de la
discussions
belleza de los
about the
objetos,
beauty
de
of
su
the
valor
objects,
científico,
their
de su
scientific
valor
value,
histórico
historical
artístico,
or artistical
y en
values.
realidad
And
lo que nos ha
actually,
preocupado
we've been
principalmente ha
concerned
sido
mainly
de qué manera podemos
about
comunicar esto con un público.
how we can
Ya
communicate
sea el
this to the
público que
public, be
habitualmente
that
viene a los museos,
the public
pero
that
especialmente
normally
con
visits
aquellos que no
museums, but in
vienen
particular
y que están
those
en la
that
calle,
normally do
pasan
not
por
come,
delante
that
de
they
nuestras
just walk
ventanas
by our
y los
doors, our
observamos.
windows, and we see them
Y
go
esa
by.
observación que hacemos
That
es
observation we
suficientemente
make, is
profunda,
that
o es
done
necesario una reflexión más
deep
aguda.
enough, or
¿De
do
qué
we
manera
need more further
somos capaces de
reflection?
incentivar de que esa
Can
gente
we
comparta nuestra
motivate them
preocupación?
to share our
Esto ha sido
concerns?
algunos de los temas
These have been some of the
que
topics
mayoritariamente hemos discutido
that
en
have
estos
been
días
discussed
y que continuaremos
through these
discutiendo para
days, and
tratar
that will be
de
continued to be
promover
discussed in order to
proyectos
try
que
to
sean
promote
aplicables
projects that are
o que al menos
applicable,
nos permitan
or that
reflexionar
at
de un modo
least
más
would
profundo
allow us
sobre
to
el
reflect
espacio
more in
público
depth about the
y
public
los
space
contenidos de los museos.
and contents in
Todos los
museums.
esfuerzos individuales que hagamos
All individual
para llevar
efforts
esto
that
a
we
cabo
can
son
make to
insuficientes
do
y lo
this
sabemos.
are not enough. We
Nos
know.
interesa señalar ejemplos, señalar
We
caminos.
are interested in pointing
Pero
out examples and
Hay un
paths.
elemento que son las políticas
But
públicas.
there's an
Las
element
políticas públicas
which has to
que
do
en el
with
caso de la
public
cultura
policies.
siempre
Public policies in the
parecen
case of culture
voluntaristas,
always seem to be on the
difícilmente
basis of
son
volunteers.
visibles en el espacio
They are
público,
difficult to be appreciated in public
comparadas con las
spaces
políticas educativas,
vis-a-vis
las
educational
políticas
policies
sanitarias.
or health policies.
Me quiero
And
detener en esto último,
let
que son
me
las políticas
Stop
sanitarias,
here.
porque
Health
últimamente yo he
policies,
visto
because
que
lately I've
en las
seen
reuniones de especialistas en museos
meetings
se
with
habla
museum
de cómo
specialists.
la actividad de
There
los
is a
museos
discussion on
son
how the
capaces
activity of
de mejorar la
museums
salud de la gente.
is able to
Esto que
improve
parece,
people's health. This
hace
might
algunos años
seem,
parecería un disparate
or some
decir,
years ago would
porque
have
siempre
seemed
decimos que
crazy,
educa,
because when we say museums educate,
que es capaz de mejorar
museums are capable
educativamente
of
o
improving
ser
the
más refinado en
education
la
level, or
observación, o
come up with a more refined
en
level
la
of
apreciación de los
observation
bienes
or
culturales.
appreciation of
Hoy se
cultural
dice
assets.
que
Now,
la actividad de los
what's being
museos es capaz
debated
de
is that the
mejorar la
activity
salud
of
de la
museums
gente.
is capable
Y
of
si hacemos
improving
una
people's
brevísima
health.
reseña de esto en las
If we
políticas
make a brief
sanitarias,
summary of
veremos
these
que
and we
a fines
consider
del siglo XIX
health policies, we see that
el tema
at
fue
the end of the
la,
19th century,
que
the
las
issue
aguas
was that the
fueran,
waters
puras o al
should
menos
be
fueran
clean
custodiadas, que no tuvieran bacterias.
and
De esta
custodied
manera
for
se eliminaron
bacteria.
plagas como el
This
cólera.
way,
Luego
the
fueron las
cholera was
vacunas,
eliminated.
luego
Then
fueron los
vaccines
hospitales
came up, and
asépticos.
then
Más
aseptic
adelante
hospitals.
fueron
Later
las
on,
enfermedades
we had
precisas que consideraban
some
al
specific
cuerpo
diseases
humano
that
como la
consider the
máquina que
human body
debiera,
as the machine
trabajar
that
y
had
con
to work,
determinados remedios
and
antibióticos
with
se podía
certain
mejorar.
drugs,
Y
medication,
en las-
antibiotics
yo
could be
diría que a
improved.
partir
And
del siglo XXI y
as
luego
from
de
the
las
21st
restricciones de
century
algunas
and
sustancias como el
after
tabaco y demás,
the restriction on
a principios
substances
del
such
siglo
as tobacco, at the
de lo que
beginning
se
of
habla
the century, what's
es que
being
la gente
discussed
está sola,
is that people are
de que la
alone.
gente está aislada,
People are
de
isolated,
que en la comunidad
that in the
muchos de
community,
nuestros
many
conciudadanos
of our
han
fellow
perdido
citizens have
la razón de
lost
ser,
their
han perdido
reason for
sentido,
life.
han perdido
They lost
las
the
hábitos
meaning,
que
the
hicieron
habits
que sus padres y
that
familias
made their parents, their
pudieran
families
congregarse y tener
to be
objetivos a
together
llevar a cabo.
with objectives to be
sucediendo en el
carried
mundo
out. What's
con las
happening in the
migraciones
world
forzadas
now with forced
Y lo que está
migrations,
sucediendo en el mundo
what's
con
happening in
los
the world
gobiernos
with governments,
populistas
populist governments,
es casi
it's almost
impensable en años anteriores.
was
Y-
unthinkable.
Y es
in
ahí
the
donde
past.
los museos,
And that's where
al hablar de comunidades
museums,
y hablar del
in speaking to
público,
communities and publics,
donde encontramos que
that's
tienen
where
una
we
función
find that museums have a function, a
que puede
role
realmente ser eficaz.
that can
Cuando
really
hablamos
be
que la gente está
efficient.
aislada, que
When we
está
say
sola,
people
que
are
pierde
isolated, they
sentido,
are alone,
los
they
museos
lose
son
meaning.
aparatos
Museums
de
are
constructores de
apparatus
sentido.
to build
Son
meaning,
Situaciones formuladoras
situations
de
that
narrativas,
formulate
Son
narration.
maneras de explorar
They are ways of
íntimamente las
intimately
historias
exploring
personales de
personal
la gente, de las
stories
familias, de las
of people,
comunidades,
of families
de los
and
barrios.
communities, neighborhoods.
Son paliativos para
This
unas
is
problemáticas
palliative
que hoy en
care
día son
for
causal
problems
de
that are
enorme tristeza
currently
y desarraigo.
causing deep
En ese
sadness
sentido, creo
and
yo,
a lack
el
of sense
museo,
of belonging.
que antes
So
era
the
favorecido
museum, which
por
in
las
the past was
colecciones y
favored
las
by
riquezas que sin
collections
duda
and
son
the richness
extraordinarias
or
y que
wealth,
tenemos que
which
preservar,
are extraordinary,
tiene
we
hoy una
need to
función
preserve.
social
Now
muy,
museums
muy
have
especial.
a very special social role.
En estos días trabajamos sobre el
These
espacio
days we
público
have worked on public
y allí
space
están
and
en la
there you
observación.
are
Es decir, David
in
vino caminando desde su
observation.
hotel en la avenida
David
Diagonal
walked
Norte
all his way
hasta
from the
aquí porque
hotel,
no pudo
from
conseguir un taxi
the
porque
northern
había
diagonal,
una enorme
because he couldn't
manifestación de la
get a
CGT
taxi. There was
que
a
atravesaba
huge
prácticamente la ciudad y
demonstration
la Avenida
crossing
de
the
Mayo.
city and Avenida de Mayo. And
Bueno, ahí había
there
el espacio público en acción.
you saw
Eso es
public
espacio
space
público
in
en
action.
acción.
That's public
Esa
space in
gente lo que
action.
estaba
And that people,
manifestando
they
son
were
necesidades
demonstrating about
y se
needs.
agrupaban para
And they were
tratar de
gathering together
encontrar
to try
solidaridad en sus
to find
reclamos.
solidarity in their claim.
Eso es materia de
That
los museos.
is
Eso es
the matter for
materia que
museums.
nosotros
That is the
podemos
matter
utilizar
that we can use.
y que incluso
And that even
somos capaces de expresar el
we're even
disenso
able to
que puede hacer que esa
express lack
solidaridad
of
se manifieste de una
agreement
manera legítima.
that can show that that solidarity is expressed in a very legitimate manner.
Thank you, Enrico. And I want to stay with that tension for a minute. First, I want to take these off. Elaine talks about safe passage and peaceful assembly and so forth. At the same time, America is talking about, you know, the growing kind of isolation. And we in museums talk about connecting to new audiences in a kind of abstract way. How do you see the potential risks, either internal to the museum or external to the community, that prevent this kind of new dialogue? And, you know, is it time for us to be edgier? What about anger? What about visitors we don't like?
Anger, emotion, with reason, I think, at the moment. So I mentioned that I'm haunted, really, and I'm haunted now more about what's happening in society than even I am about what's happening to museums. Because really the one is a dependency on the other. And there's plenty to be angry about in certainly the society I'm living in, anyway. I find myself almost every 5 years coming up with a different reason why museums could be important, because society seems to be changing so quickly. And I started some years ago looking at the relationship between museums and society through a lens of learning, education. And then 10 years or so ago, I started looking at it through a lens of human rights and cultural rights. And now also looking at it through a lens of civic participation, which leads potentially on to activism and other roles as well. And I feel we do have to accept that we shift from the neutrality. I'm not sure it's ethical anymore to say that museums are neutral spaces. And that's I think that's a very significant bridge to cross, and one that's fraught with ethical issues and also political issues as well. But I don't personally feel now that it's enough to stay on the safe side of the river.
Okay. Elaine.
The museum is more important, I think, than we know, and less important than we think. And it's a conundrum I have been wrestling with for a very long time. More important because it offers, both for use and by metaphor, some notion that we were here, we tried our best, we made things, we lived among each other. The world and its nature was available to us, and we either husbanded it or we didn't. So that beacon of a marker that we came this way is one of the really important things. That beacon that we got all this stuff potentially illegally, and by being tough on each other, by hoarding, by having an alliance with the super rich, by having a whole different set of very complicated and not very pretty contextual relations, is not one of its great assets. On the other hand, I think it's one of the institutions that holds us together, whether we use it or not. There's been research about museums that people wish them to be there even if they don't wish to use them. It's a little like I might die, in which case it would be good to have a church around, but otherwise I don't need it. It's this notion that it is part of the way in which we can have some trust. Interestingly, people burn them down. People attack culture in order to break your soul. What you hear about Aleppo and other places in Syria being where the ancient monuments are being destroyed, it's because there's some connection believed between the stuff of our past and our soul and our ability to stay together and our ability to be civil to each other. So I'm persuaded that they are essential institutions and that we are not using them essentially. And therefore, that conundrum about what it is. I'm currently working on this notion of complexity, both and, that we are not that we should no longer synthesize, that many things can be true at once, that we can house the objects of faith and we can be rational at the same time, that there's many things we have to start to make the world be more comfortable with, and that is complexity. Because I think about sound bites as one of the ways in which the world is being torn apart, and that the way we are training people to understand media sound bites needs to be reversed by museums who allow us to have multiplicity of answers.
Are we talking about tension?
Tension, yes, we are.
No, sin duda.
Okay, without a doubt,
En arte,
without a
cuando
doubt, in art,
un cuadro, una escultura no genera tensión,
when a picture, when a
no hay
sculpture
ningún problema
creates no
resolver.
tension,
Es
there's
decir,
absolutely no problem to address.
lo interesante de un cuadro es
What's
cuando hay un
interesting
problema
about a
resolver.
painting
O sea que
is if it poses
frente a las
a problem
problemáticas
to
que
be
estamos
worked out, to be
hablando,
solved. So faced with
la
the
tensión
issues
es
that
un
we are
componente.
discussing,
Es un
tension
componente, yo
is
diría
one
que
element,
necesario.
and I believe it's a necessary element.
Sin tensión, sin
Without
dificultad,
tension, without
tampoco,
difficulty,
aparece o amanece la forma que deseamos para las ideas
the
que
shape that we want
proponemos.
to embody the ideas we
Por lo
propose
tanto,
fails
yo,
to
en realidad,
emerge.
en el mundo de los museos,
So in the world
encuentro
of
que
museums,
tiene un gran
I find
potencial de visión,
that
una-
there's
una
great
gran
potential for
potencial
vision.
de generar
There's
conciencia,
great
y,
potential
como
to
dije
raise
antes,
awareness,
promover sentido.
and
Por
as
lo
I said,
tanto,
of promoting
no
sense and
me
meaning.
amedrenta la tensión.
Therefore,
Es más, creo que
I fear not
en las
tension.
exposiciones,
I believe that
aquellos curadores que tienen
a
experiencia en
curator,
hacerlo,
a
provocan la
experienced, a
tensión,
seasoned
porque esa es la
curator
tensión
will
donde,
create
el
tension in an
espectador
exhibit,
encuentra los
because it is
interrogantes
in
que más se
tension
refieren
that
a
the
su propia
visitor will
dificultad.
find the questions that are more intertwined with
listo?
their own difficulties.
Thank you. We can talk to these people and listen to this for hours. I know I can. But we can't tonight. And I'm feeling actually a little somber now. So I'm going to draw this to a close. I invite you to have individual conversations with any of us at any time over the next few days, and sort of to elevate the tone, invite you all to a reception outside the doors. Thank you very much.